Welcome to Meadowlarkers 28, the Underarm Serve and Other Crimes. After an etiquette-defying last couple of weeks, Kate Fagan, Amin Elhassan, and I will confront the unwritten rules of sports. Let's start with the NBA play-in tournament. T-Wolves beat the Clippers, and they party like it's 1999. Patrick Beverley stood on the scorer's table. Karl Anthony Towns shed tears. Babies were kissed. Confetti flew from the sky. Minnesota is in the playoffs for only the second time since 2005, so naturally, people were happy, even to secure a 7 seed. But people also laughed and laughed and laughed. Shaq and Barkley sang, "We are the champions" to the 7-seeders. Was it extra or was it appropriate? You be the judge. Nick Kyrgios, threat or menace? The tennis star is known for his showmanship, the fancy between-the-leg shots, the spectacular 100-mile-an-hour running forehands, and most notoriously, the perfectly legal but ethically uncertain underhand serve. Pros frown on it as bush league, cheap shit to try to embarrass an opponent, beneath the real player. But it counts all the same. And then, of course, there is baseball. On opening day, Toronto was down 7 runs and came back to beat Texas. Down 7-0 in the 4th inning. At the end of 5, the score was tied. 2 days later, the Blue Jays were up 6-1 after 3, but Texas scored the next 12 runs and won the game 12-6. The message? It's not over till it's over. Keep playing. But a week later, in the 6th inning of Padres-Giants, with the Giants up by 9 runs, 11-2, Mauricio Dubon bunted, historically Kyrgios-style cheap shit in baseball parlance. The Giants eventually won the game 13-2, and everybody wanted to fight because the Giants kept playing. Brian Hosmer of the Padres had this to say, quote, "I definitely told him how I felt and how we felt about it. He said it was a sign given to him by their staff. I just told him, I think you've got to be a little bit smarter in that situation. You've been playing professional ball for a good amount of time. Otherwise, if you're at this level, I'm sorry, 1, 2, 3. You've been playing professional ball for a good amount of time, obviously, if you're at this level. You've got to be smarter than that." End quote. But Giants manager Gabe Kapler, he went all Herm Edwards, you play to win the game, saying, quote, "Our goal is not exclusively to win one game in a series. It's to try to win the entire series. Sometimes that means to get a little deeper into the opposition's pen. I understand that many teams don't love that strategy, and I get why. It's something we talked about as a club before the season, and that we were comfortable going forward with this strategy. It's not to be disrespectful in any way. It's because we feel very cool and strategic. It's the best way to win a series. And when I say cool, I mean calm. We're not emotional about it. We're not trying to hurt anybody," end quote. So let's have it and discuss these unwritten rules about, quote, running up the score or being unprofessional. We know there's no crying in baseball, but is there no longer mercy? Or do we all need to embrace our inner Kyrgios and Kapler and do whatever it takes, as well as our inner T-Wolf, and celebrate no matter what? So we do have our group of Meadowlarkers. We've got Amin Elhassan and we have Kate Fagan here. Welcome to both of you. Where do we go with this? Do we just start with baseball because it is the sport of the unwritten rules, or do we all have our own story where we would like to begin? Where Kate was dropping 50 on somebody at Colorado and just kept running up the score and stayed in the game, or what? I mean, where do we begin? I mean, with the unwritten rules.
I think to me the unwritten rules. First of all, there is no holier ground for unwritten rules than baseball. I mean, you can't do anything. It's like, you see how he touched his cap? I'm like, what? Like, the idea that people will fight, will actively get into an altercation over
benches will clear.
The sanctity of these rules that are written down literally nowhere is pretty ridiculous. I want to make a clear definition here right at the start. I think there are elements of the unwritten rules that are necessary for amateur sports. The moment we get to big boy leagues or big girl leagues where they pay you money, No, you don't like it, beat them. So that you never have to deal with it again. That's my stance, my generic stance on all unwritten rules. They matter when you're younger because I think it's important that you learn the etiquette of the game. But once we get to a point where everybody's getting paid, if you don't like what that guy's doing, beat him or her so that they can't do it to you.
You're teaching foundation, in other words.
Yes.
Once you're so you learn your lines so you can forget them.
It's the age-old poetic license that Amin is advocating for. I think we should also distinguish the layers of unwritten rules, because there are the ones we're talking about right at the top with baseball, where it's within the game, you don't do this, or these ramifications happen. There's also, and maybe it's just more so basketball, because basketball's more of a pickup game. There's also the unwritten rules that designate whether you are an in-group member and understand the culture of a certain sport. And here I'm thinking about, we saw this kind of go viral around Twitter during USA Basketball during the 2020 Olympics. Even something simple as basketball, if you're shooting around and if you make a bunch and then you miss, and obviously you give somebody a layup. Like, this is an unwritten rule of shooting around, or you always get the ball back if you've made a shot. And these are all ways that the game designates who is an in-group member and who understands the culture and who doesn't. And so there's, like, in basketball, because that's the one that I have existed in more, I'm more familiar with these unwritten rules. So let's distinguish between those layers too, because we can have some fun pointing out those factors as well.
Well, we have all played hoops, and somebody didn't give me my layup.
Right. Exactly.
Where's my layup?
You stand there and you're like,
right? Where's my layup? And I mean, like, or someone doesn't realize you make a shot and they take it and start shooting.
Yep.
Give me the ball back. Right.
Exactly.
True. Let us go ahead, Kate.
I was just gonna put a a cherry on that, and that in the way that this story is told in popular culture, like through Will Ferrell movies, is that the person who doesn't, you immediately know that the person who didn't give you your layup, didn't give you your ball back, is a complete idiot and doesn't understand.
You're the outsider. Game. You don't get it.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Now, these are cultural rules. These are simply, this is how we do things. Mm-hmm. And culture is a huge piece of the unwritten rule. If anything, it might be the whole piece. Okay? Mm-hmm. Let's start with basketball. Let's start with the Minnesota Timberwolves and the Clippers. Let us start with the insane, over-the-top celebration in the play-in game. What I loved about that was the reaction. I was cracking up when Shaq and Chuck were singing "We Are the Champions" for a 7 seed. The playoffs hadn't even begun. There's confetti coming down from the sky. And I just thought this was so wild. You had Patrick Beverley standing on the scorer's table.
Yep.
But what really surprised me was the reaction from a lot of the public, which was, why are you denying them joy? Why aren't you allowing them to have fun? The Timberwolves have made the playoffs once since 2005. Mm-hmm. Everybody's excited about this. Why aren't they allowed to enjoy themselves? And culturally speaking, in the other sport where you can't have any fun, baseball celebrates every round of playoffs like it's the World Series with champagne. Everything's on ice for every round. Discuss.
Yep. So I was one of the people who, believe it or not, stood up and stuck up for the Minnesota Timberwolves and their right to have joy. And here's why. It's not merely they haven't made the playoffs since 2004, when Kevin Garnett was MVP of the league. That they've made it once since 2004, since Kevin Garnett was MVP of the league. It's that they've
2018.
2018 was the other time they made it with Jimmy Butler, where they were unceremoniously gotten up out of here after 5 games. So they've never had the elation, basically, since Kevin Garnett, of sending somebody home. Not only that, but also Yeah, they've only been out of the first round, the elation of sending somebody else home, one time, and that was 2004. Meaning, in order for Minnesota to send someone home, Kevin Garnett needs to be MVP of the league, and Latrell Sprewell needs to be able to feed his family. Those are the circumstances under which, in the 30-plus year history of the Minnesota Timberwolves, they get to send someone else home. This is an organization that is mathematically the worst in the history of American professional sports. In all four of the major sports, you look at the worst win percentage, they are the kings of futility. This is Loserville. If Loserville were an actual physical place, it would be Minneapolis, Minnesota for basketball.
So and baseball, if you're counting the Twins in the postseason, they've lost, 18 straight playoff games?
But they have a World Series, and that matter. That point stands,
they have
right?
2 World Series.
Oh, I stand corrected. So,
87-91.
So when you think about the Minnesota Timberwolves and what this playing game, which forget about to the Lakers and Celtics, where we don't retire people unless they're Hall of Famers, and we don't hang banners other than championship banners. I'm talking about even Utah and Phoenix and, Indiana, places of fleeting success that is usually racked up in regular season columns and not necessarily in playoff columns. They don't even have that to point to as their history. So for them to celebrate like that, I was like, you know what? The little baby God wants to give the little baby have its toy. Let it rejoice in having its toy. Who are we to rob them of their joy, which we know is going to be short-lived, by the way. It's not like they're going on a magical Cinderella run here. This is, in essence, don't even make that noise.
This is in other words, this was your Super Bowl. You better celebrate it.
Absolutely. This is, I would use St. Peter's as an example, but obviously they shattered that one. This is University of Maryland, Baltimore County, beating the 1 seed in the first round of NCAAs. They know they're not going to go to the Final Four or the Sweet 16 or anything else. That's the time for them to have their moment.
Did you think, Kate Fagan, that Shaq and Chuck were just being really cold? Or what was your feeling when did you watch the game, or did you see the clips afterwards?
Well, like everything they do, there was some warmth within it, right? That it was clearly mocking them. And just like Amin just did, even while supporting them, at the end, Amin
also
said,
mocking them. Let the baby have its toy.
You're a little baby, have its toy. I mean, and that's part of, I would say that when it comes to this unwritten rule, I have sort of changed my stance on it. I think probably when I was in college, I definitely would have been a pure, you don't celebrate until you've reached the pinnacle person. But I think what's baked into all of this idea that you can't celebrate until you've won the championship is that you're not a serious person if you celebrate along the way. Only frivolous people would celebrate along the way. So you can't be a contender unless you're waiting until the very end.
We only celebrate the last game of the season. If you didn't win the last game of the season, you're a loser.
Yes, and I think so. A couple weeks ago, I was actually I was on the phone with Cheryl Miller of USC fame,
won a few
gold
things,
medalist, TNT broadcaster. And she was telling this story about how she was known to celebrate when she was playing for Southern California. She would do cartwheels on the court. She would do all of these things. And that when she went to play in '84 for Pat Summitt, who was very much of the mindset of like, nose to the grindstone. You don't show any joy whatsoever.
Act like you've been there before.
Exactly.
But I've never been there before.
But they would clash, and they were clashing for a long time on this '84 Olympic team until Cheryl was able to express that my joy does not mean that I'm not a serious person. Mm-hmm. And there was a meeting of the mind. So I've sort of been thinking about that a lot lately, and I was thinking about it when I saw the Timberwolves celebrating like that. Do I think that they're going to win the NBA title? No, but do I have a little soft spot in my heart that you can still be a serious person and celebrate? Yes. Why are you laughing?
What are you laughing at, Howard?
Yeah, am I not a serious person?
Oh, here we go. Back in my day,
I am,
Greg Cody,
I am laughing because I am just relaying all the snippets in my mind of Karl Anthony Towns kissing his wife, girlfriend, and the confetti and the tears. I mean, Patrick Beverley had tears streaming down his face to be a 7 seed. I mean, you have to admit there is something funny about this, right? There is something funny about this.
Very funny.
It was so crazy over the top. You had to laugh.
Let me be clear. It is absolutely comical. It was hilarious. And I am here for us to get a good laugh at their expense, right? But what I'm not here for are the people who are angrily demanding, how dare they? How dare they? And I think that's where I kind of draw the line. It's like, let them have their fun. Obviously, I'm going to have my fun too at their expense, but let them have their fun because I do know what it means to them as an organization. In the same way that years ago when I worked for the Suns, I got in a conversation with the owner, Robert Sarver, about, like, we should hang divisional banners. And he said, well, the Lakers don't. I said, well, the Lakers have, at the time, 16 championships. Yeah, they don't, because they have something to point to say, like, this is our history, this is our legacy. But you have to celebrate, I feel, success wherever success finds you.
Well, you would be a terrific Bruins fan. Because that's one of the things that you do in Boston.
Feel? I mean, I think all of your laughter has clued us into how you feel, but what do you think?
Well, number one, like in the Boston Garden, right, for example, when you go into, for years in the old building, the Bruins who own the building and the Celtics were renting the building from the Bruins. When you go into the Garden, you see all these banners, and they're all Bruins. They're all division titles. Mm-hmm. Boston Bruins 1991 Adams Division champions, right? I mean, the Celtics were the ones with the actual championship. The Bruins they've got 5 titles in their history, 4 titles in their history. They hadn't won one since 1972, but they had more banners at the Garden than the Celtics. And the Celtics only put NBA titles up there. Mm-hmm. I will defer to our good friend JJ Redick. And I think that I like to have fun because it's funny. Right? I laugh at funny things. But I think JJ was right where he said, look, you guys being the world, right? You spend all your time talking about how NBA players don't care. You talk about how the game isn't watchable except for the last 5 minutes, that everybody's selfish and they're all into their own contracts and they're all into their max deals and everything else. Then this team shows some joy and you want to ridicule them and crush them. And that's bullshit. That is where I fall, Kate. However, I'm still laughing and will continue to laugh because it was just so wildly funny. I mean, and then Pat Beverley afterwards, getting his mug up in the camera and getting fined like $30,000, because that was the other piece. To JJ's point, that the Clippers let him go, and they dumped,
No, but I'm sorry. Like,
I mean, I'm just saying that for his
one.
He's
one to me. Like,
all I'm saying is that for him, it was poisonal. That's all. Yeah, okay. Personal.
Wait, so if we're on basketball now, and I know we've got the holy ground of baseball to tread as well.
Can't wait.
But as I was thinking about this show and watching Kyrie play the Nets and the Celtics Nets game. Sorry, Kyrie played the Celtics. Don't we think it's an unwritten rule that you don't engage with the fans? Isn't Kyrie also breaking an unwritten rule?
That rule is changing. I mean, there used to be absolutely the unwritten rule that you're the professional and you can't have rabbit ears and the whole thing. But as we've seen post-pandemic or post-George Floyd and everything else, fans are getting extra. And as we've also seen even before the pandemic, that relationship between player and fan is collapsing in a lot of ways, and I think we're starting to see something totally different take place there.
I also, kind of like what you said at the start, Kate, that there are layers to this. There are layers that are based on, there are types of unwritten rules that anger your opponent versus types that anger purists, right? Kyrie talking to the crowd is angering purists, but the Celtics don't care.
No.
They have no. Whereas if the Nets were up 40 and there's 7 seconds to go in the game and Kyrie took a 3, that's an unwritten rule that the Celtics would take umbrage to.
And that's a new rule, by the way.
Well, is it? Because I feel
That's
like
a new.
it's the most universal. The most
No, no. It's a
universal of the
It's a relatively new rule. I would say, where they just dribble out the clock now. I mean, that sort of concession is something that is not 25 years old. I don't maybe 30. I remember 1982 Game 1 Eastern Conference Finals. Celtics demolished the Sixers by 40, 120, 30, 120, 181, right? 40. And Charles Bradley, Dudley Bradley's little brother, does a alley-oop jam to put the bow on this victory. And everybody was going crazy. It was a story that they did this, and the Celtics, of course, ended up losing that series in 7 games. But, right, what was crazy about that was that this was like, you don't do this. And I think, like I said, I don't know how many years it's been, but what you do notice as we start to move into some of the difference between offending the purists and are you disrespecting your opponents? Mm-hmm. When you watch an NBA game, regardless of the score, they still run their offense.
Yes.
Right? I mean, you can be up 25. The Celtics beat the Sixers this year by 50. Mm-hmm. And I was like, they're still shooting threes.
Yep.
They're still shooting threes. They're up by 47 points. They're running their offense. In baseball, they'd be fighting if you did that.
Right. So I guess I should have made the distinction. In basketball, the unwritten rule is once the shot clock turns off.
Yes.
Then
that's right. And that's what I mean about the new rule is that generally speaking, the concession just to let the shot clock run all the way down and just concede the possession.
Right.
That's not 30 years old.
Right. Yeah. I get you on that one because it's true. Because if it's 2 minutes to go in the game, the guys that are in there are all absolutely trying to score because no one wants to be in there and get a hit on their average, right? Like you pay, especially if you're a scrub player, you want your per minute averages to be fruitful. But the concept of we're up by a lot, we shouldn't try to be up by more exists in baseball, it exists in football, exists in soccer, it is probably the most universal of all the unwritten rules in terms of it cuts across all sports. That when you're up by a margin.
Let me throw.
Don't you think in basketball you can continue to be up more as long as you're sort of not trying too hard to be up by more, right? You can still run your offense, but you shouldn't. But if you're hitting threes, you're hitting threes. But you're not pressing. You're not like pounding it down low and dunking on people. So
and your starters aren't in the game. That was the other thing about who's actually doing the playing. If my second unit is just waxing your second unit, so be it. But if you're going to leave your starters in up by 35, then that changes. And I want to throw 2 quick things out culturally as well. When I was covering the Washington football team back in the day, when we talk about baseball and celebrating everything, I remember I was covering Washington and we went to Philadelphia. They had to beat Philly to make the playoffs. They beat the Eagles. And I'm in my ratty clothes, expecting a massive celebration downstairs because I come from baseball. And I walked down there, and it was just another game. I was like, why isn't it? You guys just clinched a playoff berth. Nobody is celebrating anything. And I went down there completely expecting this like free-for-all because that's what it's like in baseball. The minute you clinch in baseball, they roll out the beer. They roll out the champagne. The guys have the goggles on, and it's like...
Is it because they've been so pent up and hamstrung by all the unwritten rules that don't let them express any joy at all, that at the first opening of joy, they just explode through it?
I think it's 2 reasons. My theory on this is that it's 2 reasons. Number 1, historically, baseball, only one team made the playoffs. So you had to win the whole thing just to make the playoffs. It wasn't like the NHL where 16 of 21 teams made the playoffs or 16 of 23 NBA teams make the playoffs, where half the league or 75% of the league is actually playing in the postseason. In that league, you had to actually win your division. You had to be the best of a block. And that's why they celebrated so much. I think the other reason is the cultural nature of the sport itself. It's a game of failure. There's got to be some place. If I'm going to make it out 7 out of 10 times and be a Hall of Famer, is there some place where I get to celebrate? And I think it's getting to that point. I think that's also a piece of why baseball does what it does.
Now that we're into baseball, I get to ask this question. Why do they go nuts over the bat flip?
because the sport is designed to humble you. It's a game of failure. And because it's a game of failure, you are angering the baseball gods by getting too excited about something when we all know how hard this game is. And because this game is so hard, you have to respect how hard it is. That's cultural piece number one. But the true cultural piece, to my feeling about this, is that baseball is the only sport where the defense has the ball. Baseball is the only sport where the defense polices you. I mean, if we're playing basketball and I dunk on you, what are you going to do? You're going to take the ball out of the hoop and you're going to go do your thing. Baseball, we start the next possession with me with the ball and I fucking throw it at you. Right? I mean, that's what's going to happen next. You hit a home run, you act a little too fresh. The pitcher is policing the nature of how the sport is played on every possession.
I think it's important to note that this is baseball's unwritten rule as told by the United States of America.
Also, I was going to say, let's not forget the racial and cultural aspects of that. If you look around the world at how the rest of the world plays baseball, one of the things about baseball, that we've talked about this on the show, is that baseball makes you adapt to it as a culture way more than any other sport. Basketball does the best job of adapting to who plays it. At one point, the game was played, it was a Jewish sport. Then it became a college sport. Then it becomes a black sport, a more blacktop urban game, and whatever. Now it's an international game. And it adapts to who's playing it. Baseball in the United States at the major league level makes everybody adapt to pre-integration, 19th century, early 20th century, angry, immigrant, very, very ethnocentric sort of rivalry type of sport where it's a hooligan's game in a lot of ways. Look at the way they play Korean baseball. Bat flips fun, they do it. Korean, Dominican baseball, same thing. Negro League baseball. They all play the game very different. But the minute you come to the major leagues, suddenly you have to play the game like it's 1925 and Walter Johnson is going to throw the ball at your back.
Are we on to baseball now? Or
It appears so.
Yes.
Because there's a little bit left in basketball before we move on to baseball.
There is, Kate, go.
Well, because one of the key unwritten rules, and I maybe you two seem more historically inclined when it comes to this type of thing, is you can't shoot after the whistle has blown. And if you do, I'm gonna jump up and block it. Like you are not allowed. I mean, you can do it, but then somebody has to go up and goaltend it.
Yep.
So, like, that seems to be a somewhat recently developed unwritten rule in basketball in particular, that you can't get an extra shot if you're trying to find your rhythm and then the whistle blows. And that seems somewhat recent to me. I don't know if Amin...
Wasn't it Garnett who was the guy who was always just snatching the ball out, making sure that didn't happen? You know, once again, policing our house and, trying to create some intimidation. Where that is most pronounced is hockey. You take a shot at the goalie after the whistle, you're getting punched in the face.
Why? Like, what? Well, because I can understand it in basketball to some degree.
Because the puck hurts.
Yeah, the puck is a missile.
Yeah. Yeah, you do that, or when you're finishing off a play and the whistle blows and you snow the goalie a little bit of snow, and you're getting punched in the face.
I love hockey.
Like, hard. You're gonna fight.
I love hockey because it's unlike baseball where it's like, you've hurt my honor. I like that in hockey the fights are happening because, hey man, that actually is
exactly baseball.
That's
and it was
dangerous.
So funny, like when you walk into a baseball clubhouse, there are so many people in baseball who say this sport has the most fake tough guys in any of the sports because it's all about perception and honor, where the other sports are about pain.
Right.
It hurts. You just put a stick in my face.
Does football have unwritten rules other than running up the score? I'm trying to think what football has as an unwritten rule. I feel like, you're not supposed to kind of like keep going for first downs. And stuff.
Can we stay here on this for a second in fact, in all of the sports?
Uh-huh.
Part of the cultural deal of the unwritten rule is this idea of running up the score, which is unprofessional, right? Mm-hmm. However, In tennis, very similarly, they talk about when a player is injured. It's really difficult to concentrate when your opponent is injured, because do you go for the kill because you know they've got a quad or a cramp or something? But then again, on the flip side, if you don't and that person comes back, then they get to write a hero origin story at your expense because you sort of eased up on them. And so when we're talking about running up the score, whether it's football, and obviously in football, in college football, there's an advantage to running up the score. You're supposed to run up the score in football, especially if you're a ranked team. If you win all your games, like remember that Notre Dame team, whichever year it was, where they were winning their games, 21-17. Nobody thought they were any good. You got to go out there and win 66-0.
Right.
And so you have this weird cultural thing where you are running up the score, one, because your sport asks you to, and then in other sports, like baseball, you run up the score and you're not supposed to. But what's really messed up about baseball is as the game moves more and more and more toward offense, you had 2 games already in the first week of the season where teams wiped out big leads. All right. I think the Rangers were up 7-0 opening day on the Blue Jays. Blue Jays end up winning the game. 2 days later, the Blue Jays are up like 7-1 or something, 6-1. They end up losing the game 12-6. But the instance that got the most play, excuse me, the game that got the most play was San Francisco and the Padres, where the Giants bunt, and now they want to start fighting because it's a 9-run game. So when do you stop? If you don't keep scoring, now you're the team that loses 13-11. Are you supposed to just give up at bats now? I mean, that's why I sort of respect in the NBA now. If you're up by 20, that you keep scoring because the game's not over. And my theory is, Kate, that the reason why running up the score is such a big deal in football and baseball is because it's harder to score.
Right.
It's much, much easier to score in basketball, and you can shoot your way into a big lead. You can also shoot your way out of a big lead in the NBA. Maybe that's part of it.
But there's also something to the fact that there's a clock in football, basketball, other sports we've talked about, and that so there's a mathematical equation going on, which is, okay, if my lead is this and there's this much time left, and I'm sure we could have a 538 graph that shows us when we've gotten to the point of essentially 99.99% winning percentage chance. Whereas like in tennis, and you're the expert here, Howard, on this, but you kind of always have a chance.
Score. You're playing to a score in tennis.
You always have a chance in tennis. Well, but that's no different. But is that any different than baseball in terms of you have? That's
where the question is like, it's similar to baseball, but different in that there's no clock, and then therefore you always have an out left, right? Until you don't have an outlet, you have an outlet. But in tennis, there's that mechanism if you win this one set, you get the whole set.
Yeah.
Credited to you if you come back from it, versus that doesn't quite exist in any of the other sports.
Which is how you get lucky duckies, right? Yeah. Which is how you go out. The lucky ducky, if you're not a tennis person, is how you win the match by losing total points.
Right.
Right. I mean, you can do that in that sport. The other team can score, and the other player can win more overall points, and you lose the match.
Right. I was thinking about the sense of in tennis, like a blowout, so to speak, hastens the end of the game, the end of the misery, right? If I go out there, 6-love, 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 quick work, right, for the most part. In basketball and football and hockey, there's a clock.
That's
the misery has to end at some point, regardless whether I score 1 point or 1,000 points. In baseball is the only sport that if I keep scoring, the
game gets longer and longer
and longer. The game will
not
end. If I score 100 runs in the first inning, guess what? If I keep trying to score in innings 2 through 9, the game will never end. It'll never end. And I think
and that's the reason why the penalties are so harsh in baseball.
Right.
Because, hey, we're all trying to get out of here. Like, okay, but here's the question. We just mentioned 3 examples where, because of the offense and the way that you can score in today's sporting events, Gabe Kapler, the manager of the Giants, was like, no, we're here to play, man. We're here to keep playing, and we're going to keep grinding. And if we were up by 9 runs today, then that's good. But if in scoring 9 more runs, we can hurt your bullpen for tomorrow, we're going to do that too. And he said, well, I know that's not really popular. I know people don't like that, but that's how we're going to play the game. And I was thinking about this just from the standpoint of competition. Like, what am I supposed to do with all my at-bats if I'm up 12-1 in the 3rd inning?
Well, I guess you're just supposed to like take.
You're supposed to swing at the first
Average,
pitch is what you're supposed to do.
yeah.
When you concede that, baseball-wise, you're supposed to just, let's get out of here. But the other team is still giving max effort. So why aren't you giving max effort?
Let me ask you a question. Let's go. Let me take this a back up a few thousand feet. You look around baseball, the oldest player is going to be what? Around 40 years old?
Yeah.
Roughly.
Unless
right?
it's a pitcher, then you can get up to the mid-40s.
But
Tom
most
Brady.
of these guys are in their 20s, right? Young players. The game is fairly diverse. We have players from the Caribbean. We have players from East Asia. We got players from Central America. Why you said earlier, Howard, that it's the sport that makes you adapt to its culture, but how is that culture still being propagated when the game is young and diverse way more than it was when Honus Wagner and all those guys played? How are they capable of keeping this system in place despite it being unwritten?
Because this standard is considered the highest standard of competition. And nobody looks at the Japanese league and says, okay, it's the equivalent of the major leagues. They say, oh, it's a high minor league. Nobody looks at the Dominican league and says, in winter ball, the Caribbean series, that, oh, it's the same as big league. Like, there is a mythology surrounding the major leagues. Like, when you think about how much, because baseball's so old, and when you think about how much baseball even exists in our speech. Hey, Kate, you want to go have dinner tomorrow? No, I'll take a rain check, right? I mean, baseball is inbred in everything we do and all the things that we say, and so the culture comes with it. And I think that that's one of the things that makes baseball so strange is that you're adapting to a culture that doesn't even exist anymore.
Right.
The United States does not operate the way it did in 1916, but baseball rules are expected to adhere to a time that doesn't even exist anymore. Like, for example, like one of the problems when we talk about why is the sport, unwritten rules are a big reason why the sport doesn't have as much popularity, because in addition to the game being played the same way it was played around World War I, World War I was also barely radio, no television, all newspaper. So you really weren't necessarily going to draw a lot of attention to yourself because nobody was looking at you. And now you get to today where everybody is looking. When you get into the television age, baseball doesn't want you to be Deion Sanders. They don't want you to show attention to yourself or draw any attention to yourself. They don't essentially want to live in the modern age when today's athlete is looking at the camera. You look at the camera too much in baseball, you better duck the next time you step in the batter's box, which runs completely counter to a modern society. Amin is rolling his eyes right now.
It's so silly. It is so silly, and it's amazing to me. Like you just mentioned the manager for the Padres.
Well, the manager of the Padres, Bob Melvin, was the one who was mad. You're thinking of Gabe Kapler, the Giants.
Yeah. 3, 2, 1. You just mentioned the manager of the Giants, Gabe Kapler, saying, "Yeah, this is how we're gonna play this, right?" And it's like, it took you guys 100 years for a guy to show up and say, hey, if we do it this way, we actually wear them out and make tomorrow a lot easier for ourselves. It took 100 years for someone to say, no, I'm not going to do the thing. And especially, again, if it's kind of the same people, the same old heads holding court, I get it. But it's like you've got all these people coming from all these different backgrounds. And everyone just kind of shrugs and says, I know it doesn't make sense, but this is the highest level of baseball, and this is how they want it done. Something that literally doesn't happen in any other sport. Why are they so dogmatic when it doesn't make any sense?
Okay.
Well, part of the, like, you mean saying, let's take this to the 1,000-foot view. Part of all of the layers of the unwritten rule that we're talking about, too, is the question of what is good for the game because as I was thinking about this episode of Meadowlarkers, I was of course thinking about like my wheelhouse of women's basketball, and a lot of unwritten rules that exist. Not a lot, but one key one in particular, which is like an unwritten rule, because I think one thing we haven't touched on is unwritten rules that might exist that are tangential to the game. They're not exactly between the lines. So, for example, one unwritten rule in women's basketball in particular that has just recently started to break is that if you are in women's basketball, you do not talk ill about women's basketball. And that existed for a very, very long time.
Yeah, you're building the sport. I get that.
That's a necessary unwritten rule, though, right?
But it also gets to a point, because it started. I mean, you start breaking it, and it's a necessity to then break it, because otherwise you create a very small world where there's actually none of the reality and the texture and the dynamic nature of the sport is being revealed to anybody else, because it's very much, we're all role models, we're all happy, we're all grateful, and you need people to break those unwritten rules. And so
you undermine labor.
Yes. I'm wondering, in like the growth of other sports, whether there are unwritten rules about how you talk about the game and your opponent, because in women's basketball, it's only been in the last 15 years that you will even see people suggest that the WNBA should do something differently, or this is a flaw in the women's game that should be changed, because it was very much, let's just protect our little piece of the pie.
Yeah, there's one piece of this that I want to get to before we go to this next thing in our final segment here, to what Kate was talking about. One of my favorite unwritten rules, and of course we'll go to baseball. My favorite unwritten rule in baseball is that African American players do not fight each other. Black, Dominican, Cuban, Puerto Rican, they'll throw down with each other, and they'll throw down with Black Americans. American-born Black people in baseball do not duke it out. Think about it. When was the last time you saw two American-born brothers fighting on a baseball field?
Well, you'd
doesn't happen.
You'd have to find two brothers playing at the same time.
And then there's that, right? But this goes back to Jackie Robinson.
Hand in hand too with what these.
But it goes to what
Howard.
Exactly. This is why I brought this up, Kate, because you had Black players in the game trying to make it, trying to not just make it, but to prove that they belonged and could be trusted as citizens. Which, remember, when we're talking about baseball, we're also talking, because it's the first American institution to fully integrate. So the question was, I mean, I know, Kate, when you're thinking about it from a women's basketball standpoint, we're thinking about it in terms of economics mostly, to build and grow the sport. But for Black baseball players back in the 40s and 50s, it was, can they be trusted to behave? None of that malice at the palace shit, right? Which we saw in the 80s with basketball as well, and then obviously into the 2000s. This idea at the end of the day that Black people are really kind of dangerous and violent, and we need to control them. And Jackie was one of the guys who was, really was, I need to comport myself in a way, because the real question with baseball had been, if we can get along here in the national pastime, then why can't we all go to school together? Why can't I live next door to you? So that pressure was on Black players to behave. And part of that legacy was, very rarely did you see, Black American, even Bob Gibson, who would hit everybody. No Black player charged Bob Gibson, maybe out of sanity as well, but you just didn't see that. I remember, and I didn't even know this until I was covering the Yankees, and David Justice said to me one day, think about it, when was the last time you saw it? And then I went back to all the old guys. I mean, even Dave Stewart, who was as fearsome as anyone. No, white guy might charge me. He fought with Pat Corrales, and they had fights. But right. Black to Black, it's like it's the craziest unwritten rule in baseball.
Wow.
Sorry, in your reporting, Howard, or all the conversations you've had around a baseball field, is this a thing just absorbed as you're coming up?
Well, and that's also because, and that was one of Dusty Baker's points, which is, in today's game, they don't communicate with each other the way they did back then, where there was this very, very clear network of black players in the game, and they all went out to dinner afterwards, and they all talked to each other, and they all gave each other pointers about which cities. Here's how you navigate this city, and here's how Philadelphia is different than Cincinnati and Boston and the rest of these cities. So these guys had a real network, and the reason was also because that network wasn't just about baseball. You were integrating an American business, and the rest of the businesses in the country was going to follow your example. Because the thing that the players were, Hank Aaron used to tell me this all the time. Anytime somebody black did something, we talk about this in other things, it sticks.
Right.
See how they are, see how they are, see how they are. And so Henry was one of the guys, Sad Sam Jones, who pitched for the Giants. He and Aaron had a feud, and it was a really public feud because it was so rare. But even they didn't get into a fight on the diamond. You just don't see it very often, if ever.
Are there any unwritten rules in journalism?
Well, you know what? Yeah, when it comes to, and I wonder how you deal with this, Kate, black reporters covering black athletes. They are absolutely, basketball may not be that because it's 80% black league. Everybody just does their thing. But in baseball, you really had to be aware of who you were writing about and how you were writing about them because, there just weren't a lot of us in terms of black reporters. And so when the players would see a black face with a notepad, they would assume that was a friendly face. And if you weren't, you heard about it. Like I remember the time, didn't Milton Bradley call Jason Reed and Uncle Tom? You know what I mean? This type of stuff. Yeah. There's an although Milton Bradley was out there, but there was an expectation that you were going to at least, if not advocate for the black player, you were going to understand. You were supposed to understand. Charles Barkley talks about this a lot as well in basketball, where he's like, we just never saw a lot of black reporters. We had an expectation that they were going to understand. And so if it was a black reporter who was one of the guys burying you, that never played well.
Yeah. That's interesting because yesterday I was talking to a former Sports Illustrated writer who was one of the women, Melissa Ledke, who helped
legend.
Break open, the locker rooms in baseball so that women could cover them. But she was talking about how in the 70s and 80s at SI, if you were a woman on staff there, you never pitched stories about female athletes because you didn't want to be seen. You didn't want to be sent to Siberia.
Yeah, they're going to ghettoize you. Mm-hmm.
No, yeah, exactly. Oh, you cover them and no one want to read them and you'll get fewer assignments. It was like, and that kind of had a double whammy on women's sports too, because you'd think, oh, if we get more women writing for something like SI, maybe there will be more charitable coverage and viewpoint and more people pitching stories. But it actually had the opposite effect because female writers didn't want to be covering quote unquote lesser sports.
Well, the women had to prove that they could hang with the boys, right?
Exactly. You had to prove that like you could do the profile on the big stars. But I have another one for you, Amin, unless you want to jump in.
Yeah, just really quick, an example of that as well. I've worked in the WNBA in a couple of stops. I worked for Liberty in PR for a year, and then I was a video coordinator for the Mercury for 2 championships, I want to say. And it staggered me how many people worked in the WNBA were there just to move on. Like, no one working in the WNBA actually wants to work in the WNBA. They want to work in the NBA. And by the way, that's men and women. Whatever the position, marketing, PR, community relations, basketball operations, whatever you did, everyone coaching, everyone was kind of like, yeah, this is just like another stepping stone.
But it makes sense. You can see it.
And it makes perfect sense, but it's also one of the foundational issues of the WNBA, which is that if you look around at the NBA, we argue meritocracy on this podcast a lot, but pretty much like everyone who's doing their job is pretty fucking good at their job. And you are exploiting whatever data point or economic point you can exploit, you will exploit it. You look at the WNBA, if someone is good at their job, they are gone. Mm-hmm. So, and those are the people. So it's like, but then people will say it's the product itself. And you're like, well, we also can never keep the best marketers. We can never keep the best ticket people. because they're moving on. But here's something, and it's crazy that we now have an open a door for me to tell this story. But what I thought was an unwritten rule at ESPN, clearly Amin did not think was an unwritten rule back when we were at ESPN together. Because whenever I'm in the same room or the same Zoom/podcast as Amin, I think about how I was on First Take one time. And all of those shows, you're cramming 12 different storylines that you're not an expert. Hopefully you're an expert at 2 to 3 of them. And the rest of them, you were just trying to study in time to become an expert. And it was some segment on the NBA. And I must have made a point that was not the most highbrow educated point. And Amin, you tweeted at me, calling me out for this while we were both at ESPN. And then I thought you had broken an unwritten rule because I thought you would know, look, I'm trying to pretend I'm an expert at a lot of different things I'm not an expert at. The last thing I need is someone in-house calling out my lack of expertise. Right. But
that's just
now
a bad
I know
teammate right there, isn't it?
Now I know you better. And I'm like, that is on brand. That is on brand. Not being a bad teammate, but like you speak what you think is true in the moments that they happen. Do you remember this at all?
I do not, but there's a couple of things.
I've done so many, I don't remember this one.
I mean, I'd say this with no pride, but yes, I have done so many. First of all, I would argue that it is a written rule because I have gotten called to the principal's office for saying things about the quote ESPN on ESPN crime is what they call it. For me, I think a lot of it was I was an outsider at the time. I think I'm a lot more knowledgeable about the world of journalism, but at the time I was just like, that's not right. And I was just like, whatever. Also, we didn't know each other. And because to me, that's one of my unwritten rules. There's no bigger pet peeve I have in life than someone who knows me, who has my phone number, says, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to tweet about how upset I am about what it means. So if you're upset about it, why don't you give me a call? You can reach out. Like
professionalism.
Yeah, I'm just saying it's not even professionalism, Howard. It to me is you're not really upset about what I said or what I did. You are using this as an opportunity to be performative in order to curry the favor, to curry favor on the social media masses, so you get your day in the sunlight. And to me, it's like if we know each other, or we're reasonably close enough. Meaning, I might not have your number, but I know Mike Golick Jr. and you know Mike Golick Jr. We're both really great friends. I can go to Mike Golick Jr. to get your number. That's what irritates me. With Kate,
100%.
It was probably I was just young and dumb, and also I don't know. I didn't know you were just a random person on TV to me.
Yeah, well, and that happened.
And it wasn't. Yeah, just to clarify, it wasn't that important, right? It must have been that I was like, oh, the Suns are a good 3-point shooting team because I'm trying to like keep all this data in my head, and you probably tweeted that. Yeah, the Suns are actually in the bottom third of. So it wasn't like a big social political point. It was a small thing, but I remember DMing you and being like, yo, next time can you just like hit me up on the side on that and not put me on blast?
Right. Well, and you know what? And this does not count as an unwritten rule because we do have a policy at ESPN that you don't criticize each other. That we're all in the same team. We're not supposed to put each other on blast on Twitter or whatever. Can gee, what a sucky column by the person who like sits right next to me. But, we're supposed to be in the same group. You're not supposed to do that. Last section I want to talk about as we start to wrap is the one thing that we haven't really spoken about. I mean, you brought it up earlier, which was, okay, if you don't like what I'm doing, beat me. Part of the unwritten rule, maybe the biggest piece of the unwritten rule, is the idea of professional respect. Are you showing me up? Are you playing the game properly? Are we supposed to be sportsmen, sports people, are we supposed to be sports professionals? And most of these unwritten rules are really rooted in respect. Right? If I'm down by 20, why are you rubbing it in my face? And these are the things that also, one, create rivalries. So they actually create the things that we say we want in the sport. We want a little bit of saltiness. We want to create that intensity, but we also are told that we should know better. But none of these sports have a mercy rule. So because they don't, you're not waving the white flag. You're not just throwing the towel in the fourth inning and saying, okay, we'll go get them tomorrow. So how do you all feel about the root of the unwritten rule which is respect, which is, are you playing this game? When I say play the game the right way, I mean, those foundational things that you were talking about at the start with the kids. We're teaching you how to compete ethically. You're on mute.
You're on mute.
Put you on blast.
Bring there. That's unfair. No, I'm laughing, by the way, because I found the tweet.
Whoa, you did? That must have been like 7 years ago.
Oh, it was exactly 7 years ago, almost to the day, April 10th, 2015.
Wow, the anniversary is just passed.
I said Steph Curry's on-off rating is in the plus 17 range. Harden's is plus 6. So Kate Fagan. Rocks wouldn't be an 8 seed if they switched spots. Oh my God.
There you go.
So sportsy. Why do I
Well, I'm
care?
glad we cleared that up.
Why did
I'm
I
glad
care?
you got that out
Now
there.
Why am I trying to make a fool out of my colleague?
It's just like, about what? About the dumbest thing. Like, would the Rockets be better? Would they be the same? Who cares?
Pedantic Amin Elhassan.
Super pedantic. Trite and pedantic. No, it brings us full circle, the comment you made. It's the idea that these are traits that I think, or we think as a society, that we should all have, right? That we want our children to grow up gracious, right? Gracious in defeat and magnanimous in victory.
And we're told that's what sports is supposed to teach us.
Right. Yes. And exactly. Hey, being a good teammate and helping your guy up and making the extra pass and all that. And then you get to the real world and you realize that many of the people who are most successful are the ones who openly eschew those things, right? The right pass, making the right play. No. The guy who gets the glory is the guy who takes the shot, even though it's not the right play. And so, with that in mind, I think to myself that yes, I think we should continue to have mercy rules and all these things for younger levels of the sport, even up to college, if you feel like they're still in an embryonic state.
An actual mercy rule?
Whatever, like
in the NBA at the end of 3, down 35, go get them tomorrow?
The moment we cut checks,
we play 48.
We play 48, and if you don't like it, I stand on that ground. If I'm the guy beating you by 50 or losing by 50, that is your right as the victor to do as you please, as long as it's not dirty or putting anyone in danger physically.
Can you imagine pulling the ripcord in sports? You pay $75 for a ticket, and we're done.
No,
we don't have it today.
After 3, yep.
we don't. We don't have it today. Yeah. Good night, everybody. Drive home safe. It's the second inning. It's 12-0.
You don't want to watch this either. Come on.
I mean, do you really want to see my left fielder pitching? It's 18-2. See you later, everybody.
I mean, are you good there? I didn't want to trample on you if you were still going.
I'm good. I'm still laughing at the fact that I found.
Oh, the tweet. Yeah.
What about that, Kate?
I would say, and this is sort of thinking out loud here, that in playing hoops, one thing I learned along the way was that, because we're talking about two things: one, respect for your opponent, and then the other, respect for the game. Mm-hmm. And those, not every opponent is going to believe that respecting the game looks the same. Like the Cheryl Miller Pat Summitt story. Cheryl Miller respecting the game looked like expressing joy and exuberance, and to Pat Summitt it looked like stoicism and acting like you've been there. But to each of them, the respect for the game was the fuel in their behavior.
That's right. And those points are regionalized and racialized, and it all depends on where you come from, and gender and history. So once again, one of my favorite things is when people talk about how, and I don't know how your coach is, Kate. I remember when I played, just even in high school, your high school coach, if your team lost, nobody could smile.
Right.
You just had to be funereal on the bus.
Yeah, and that existed all the way through college. I mean, the amount of meals, you wouldn't be given because you lost a game. Like this was all a kind of punishment, because all driven by this idea of this is how you behave. It has to be as if you are mourning something if you lost the game. which is odd because you had to mourn losing, but you couldn't celebrate winning.
Right.
That's
so
right.
it was like,
Well,
okay.
and to put a nice bow on this, as all the old heads are angrily shaking their fists at the clouds at the concept of the television show Winning Time, but it does touch upon that with Magic Johnson, that people thought Magic wasn't serious because he looked like he was having fun play basketball, which is just the most asinine, ridiculous kind of surmise anyone could make, that somehow he's less competitive, he's less serious, he doesn't care as much because he enjoys playing this child's game.
But we have created a culture of how you're supposed to behave. I remember when I was covering the A's, and the A's lost a lot of games that first year. They lost 88 games. And so we would go into the clubhouse, into the manager's office, and Art Howe, who's a really great man and a really nice person, but after a loss, he had that old school attitude that nobody was supposed to laugh at, and that included the writers. I'm like, I don't play for you. And so we would be in his office, and he would like stare at all of us and wait for someone to just do something so he could just blow, so he could just go off. He was waiting. Give me your reason to lose my shit right now because we've lost our 8th game in a row. So he'd be looking around like, okay, which one of you chumps is going to ask me a stupid question so I can just let you have it, right? And this is happening at the pro level at all times. You know, how do you respond? Like Larry Bird used to say it all the time about Kevin McHale. He didn't. And he used to say it about Clyde Drexler. Doesn't take losses hard enough. So we are really policing your facial expressions after we lost on a buzzer beater.
They did the same thing to David Robinson. David Robinson wasn't say, "Oh, you're not upset enough after losses." What am I supposed to do?
What do you do? You want to flip the spread? Am I supposed to, Yes, you're supposed to flip the spread.
Yeah.
That shows you care.
Yeah, this idea, I mean, it exists even outside of sports about the way people thinking that whoever made the rule that there's a unilateral way to respond to tragedy, loss, sports loss. It's all mirroring society as well. And it's like some person or some fraction of society along the way of culture decided this is how you behave. And there, in sports especially, there hasn't been a lot of evolution from that. Like you said with baseball, this idea of like losing must generate this response has been flawed for a long time. And yet you very quickly learn as you're coming up in it that you have to mimic the behavior that culture tells you when you lose, or you suffer pretty serious consequences within your team and from your coaches.
Well, let's not forget that one of the great unwritten rules was actually a written rule for years in baseball, which was no fraternization. You weren't supposed to talk to the other team. You weren't supposed to talk to them. You weren't supposed to smile at them. You weren't supposed to do any of it.
Yep.
And that was actually that's in the baseball rule book. I mean, that was in the handbook of how you played the game. And Amin is losing his shit right now.
Yeah, he's laughing at this.
And the thing that changed it, when we talk about not having a lot of evolution, one of the biggest things that changed it was free agency. And the fact that the players had a union. It was like, no, we can talk to each other. I mean, in the old school guys will be like, we're over here, you're over there, you're not supposed to talk at all. But now they all have the same agents and they change teams and we might be teammates next year. And the money and the free agency and the ability to actually change teams killed that rule. It wasn't an unwritten rule, but it was very much a concrete part of the sports culture.
Yeah.
I thought you were going to say the unwritten rule that was once a written rule was no black people.
That was the unwritten rule.
It was written before
yeah, exactly. Well, I think this is a wrap for us. It's good. I mean, I kind of like this because one of the things that you see most in the sport, we talk about the culture changing, and then the sports, the unwritten rules, as much as we say we hate them or dislike them or whatever, they are the culture in terms of how we react. We laugh at the Timberwolves, but when a team wins the wild card in baseball, we're like, yeah, right? They're dumping champagne on each other. They've got like 3 more series. And so, but once again, it all comes down to culture, and it's fun to watch. And that is that from Meadowlarkers 28. We will see you next week. Amin, Kate, out.